Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video all about nonfiction classics. And this is just kind of in a way going to be a video about strategies to read classics of nonfiction, as I know that can be a pretty intimidating genre to read when it is published now. But then there is an added layer of intimidation of reading a classic of nonfiction. But this is also just going to be me exploring basically the three biggest books that are on my physical TBR. And I think these are, in terms of page count, literally the largest books that I have in total, nonfiction or fiction. But these strategies that I'm going to talk about today are going to be the strategies that I employ to tackle these three books. So the three biggest books that are certainly on my classics shelves, but I think just in general are the three largest books that I have on my physical TBR are The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. And this is an abridgment. So isn't that scary to know that the actual thing is much longer than this? And the sad thing is, I think they cut the chapters that I would be most interested in from this abridgment. But this is one that I actually have a dream of completing in full. I think that I can get a free Kindle edition and I can supplement the chapters that I don't have in this physical copy. Basically, you are only ever going to find an abridged physical copy. I think Penguin publishes a 3-volume set that is all of this, but they are very, very expensive in my opinion. And I think you'd be paying over $100 to get all 3 volumes. But I think that might be a good way to go if you want this one physically. I've always felt like I wanted a physical edition of this to sit on my shelves, especially after I finish it. But the abridged edition might be all that I'm able to do. One that haunts me is a book that has been sitting on my shelf for over a year now, and that is The Complete Essays of Michel de Montaigne. And this is an essay collection, just like it sounds. Michel de Montaigne was a French writer of the Renaissance, and he essentially created the essay as we know it. I don't know if I said, Edward Gibbon was writing in the 18th century, and this is really one of the blueprints for modern historical nonfiction writing. So it's very important, not only in terms of its subject matter, but just in terms of how the genre of history is now written. In a similar vein, Michel de Montaigne is basically the blueprint for the modern day essay. And this is one that I'm torn on. I really didn't know whether or not I should even discuss it in this video, because as an essay collection, it's very clearly a book that you can pick up here and there throughout time and just read an essay every once in a while and just gradually make progress on this. It is not a linear narrative by any stretch of the imagination, but it is in fact, I think, the longest of the three of these books. In some ways, it is also the most intimidating of the three to me, because I historically don't do very well with things like short story compilations or essay collections, because I will start them and I will start them with good intentions and I will read a few of them here and there, but I will never wind up finishing them. And so that's kind of my concern here. I don't want this one to be another example of that. This edition is over 1,250 pages long. And this is the full. This is not an abridgment, which is really exciting, but it is certainly one that I am pretty intimidated by. The last of these is The Iconic Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell. This is another book that's haunted me because I have had it for literally years. It's been sitting on my physical TBR for so long. It is a book that I have also started a couple of times. And what trips me up here is that I really feel the urge to annotate this one. This is also from the 18th century, and it seems like the 18th century was just a time when people wanted to wax poetic for 1,000 pages. And I think that's essentially how long this one is. Yes, this is over 1,000 pages, but just. A lot of this towards the back are different appendices and notes to the book itself. This is a biography, just like it sounds, and I did not intend this, but kind of akin to Michel de Montaigne and also to Gibbon. This kind of also was a trendsetter in how we write biography. So all three of these books are really long, but they're also kind of trendsetters for their niche within nonfiction. I will say I'm not always pulled to reading very long fiction books either. It's not just nonfiction that intimidates me, but I would say Actually, it probably is nonfiction that just intimidates me. I'm not intimidated by a long fictional book. In fact, if the book is really good, I'm very excited that there is a large page count because I can kind of divorce myself from the page count with fiction, especially if it's a story that I'm enjoying, and then the page count just no longer matters because I'm just so invested in the story. That's not the case with nonfiction, though there is often a linear narrative. It is not always as enjoyable as fiction. I will say, classic nonfiction, though, this is something that is a good tip to keep in mind. I don't find nonfiction classics to be as dryly written as modern nonfiction. I think modern nonfiction is really setting forward to tell you something, and it's not often written with entertainment in mind. In some ways it is. Popular history, for example, is definitely meant more for entertainment than for historical scholars. But nonfiction of the past almost always had a popular element to it, something really enjoyable to it. There's humor in it. That's certainly going to be the case with the life of Samuel Johnson, and I've heard it's also the case with Edward Gibbon. In the past, nonfiction was not always straightforward, particularly when we're talking about history. It's only been in the past couple hundred years that history has made the move to basically really citing your sources, making sure that everything you quote is sourced in the narrative. This is particularly true of the ancient historians. They are just gossip filled. It's just about gossip. And a lot of it's about hearsay. And so there is an enjoyable quality to, especially I would say, history nonfiction classics that you might not find in the way that authors are writing nonfiction today. A very, very popular strategy for tackling modern nonfiction as well as nonfiction classics is one that I am going to employ for at least 2 of these big books, and that is using an audiobook. A lot of people swear by audiobooks. I'm not an audiobook girly. Y'all know this about me by now, but I am particularly not a fiction audiobook girly. So nonfiction audiobooks have been the biggest hits for me in terms of audiobook reading. I have the audiobooks of both of these, full audiobooks that I got from Audible. So I'm really excited about that. But one thing that is a struggle for me personally, and it may not be a struggle for you, so this may not be a tip that would help anybody but me, but I don't tend to focus very well on an audiobook. I particularly don't enjoy just listening to an audiobook and doing nothing else. And so I often have to be doing something to occupy my hands, or I'm listening to them at work while I'm doing stuff. So I'm often doing something else when I am listening to an audiobook, which means that I can get easily distracted by the task at hand. And I feel like I don't retain information from an audiobook to the same degree that I do from a physical book. And so something that I like to do, and is kind of like a comfort read thing, I just really enjoy listening to the audiobook while reading the book. And it's just kind of nice to see, especially in terms of translation, what they might have changed. But it also allows me to make notes and highlight while I am reading the book, which is something that I think the audiobook experience robs me of. Again, that very well may not be your problem. And a lot of people nowadays just in general prefer to read audiobooks than to read physically. And so this just may be your best option in and of itself. But I think audiobooks do tend to make longer books feel shorter. In the case of these 2, both of these audiobooks are over 100 hours. And I listened at over 2 times speed, but even that, 52 hours? 52 hours for one of these when I listened at 2 times speed. It's crazy. In the case of something like Michel de Montaigne's essays, this is one that it feels natural to segment out. I think that's possibly what I am going to do, and it's always sage advice when you are reading a really long book, or just in general a book that you were intimidated by, to read it while you were reading other things. And so then you don't feel bogged down in just one book by itself. While you are consistently making progress on this, you are also reading other lighter things in the mix. And so that's definitely a really great strategy, and I know it works very, very well for a lot of people, and it's the one that I am going to try with this. I think it just seems natural with an essay collection to read one here or there. My next strategy and my next little bit of advice you are going to complain about, and you're going to say, Jenny, are we in grade school? But This is something that I do think is very helpful, and it is basically to pretend like you were back in grade school and you were reading a textbook for the first time. And what was one of the things that your teacher told you when you started reading a textbook? It was to get context, right? It was to kind of look at the chapter headings, look at the structure of the book. How is the book written? That will really help you in the realm of nonfiction, especially with a subgenre of nonfiction that you're maybe not so comfortable with. History in particular, I think this is very, very useful for, because you can often tell by the chapter headings how they are going to go through history. They didn't always tell it in kind of a linear fashion in a nonfiction classic. Sometimes people will hop around. So it's kind of nice sometimes to make your own notes. And to kind of make a timeline of where you think things are going. That's just helpful in general to help you retain the information, in my opinion. It might not be as straightforward in a case like the biography of Samuel Johnson, but that's another one that you need to ask context for. Why did James Boswell write this? What was the point of this? How was it received? Some of these questions can help contextualize the book for you before you ever start reading it. But I think it's particularly helpful to look at headings, because some of these older classics of nonfiction will not only break it down by chapter, but they will often have a breakdown of paragraphs within the chapter. And sometimes you're really lucky and they put a heading above that paragraph and they kind of tell you what they're going to discuss. That's helpful for you as the reader. The strategy I'm going to end on is another strategy that I feel like is probably going to be just pretty personal to me, but I would love to know if you also do this. I think what I am going to do, particularly for the decline and fall, I am going to take notes. I am going to summarize chapters. And I have done this in the past, and what I do is I summarize the chapter within the book. So I just take notes on the last page of the chapter. This may not really have an open page to do that, and it doesn't look like it does. But that's often what I do. Or you can write on a Post-it note and slap it in there. If you're someone who keeps an extra notebook lying around just for notes on what you're reading, this is a good opportunity to do that. I think this will be particularly helpful for me with this one, where I'm going to be pairing it with an audiobook. So I'm not going to be reading this all the time and reading it straight through. There are going to definitely be gaps in my reading of this. And so if I kind of go in and summarize things, I think that will really help me when I do come back to reading it. I won't just be at a total loss. Some other strategies in terms of reading nonfiction classics, from my perspective, I think one would be to pick a book that you are very, very interested in. That sounds kind of banal, but really do pick a book on a subject that you were already interested in. Maybe even pick a book on a subject that you're pretty familiar with. That way you're not reading something new on top of maybe reading a book that you think you're going to be intimidated by the writing of, the prose. And I almost always get on JSTOR, something like that. I just read a lot on the internet before I dive into a classic of nonfiction. In many ways, I don't feel like nonfiction can be spoiled. I mean, of course it can't, especially if it's dealing with history or it's dealing with just abstract concepts, like I'm sure the essays of Michel de Montaigne are. There's not really something that can be spoiled. And so it's kind of helpful to go in with background knowledge on the author, whatever it is they're writing about, their subject of choice, and then also to kind of get context maybe from an online summary for what you're reading. I do that for all of the classics I read, actually. I look up the author. I kind of look up context for why they were writing and when they wrote this, just kind of where they were in their career, where they were in their life. But I don't often read a summary until I have read the entire book if it's a fiction classic. In terms of nonfiction, I don't care if you spoil me. I actually really, in general, also don't care if you spoil me with a fiction classic. But for me personally, long nonfiction is so much more intimidating than long fiction. I feel like if you get lost in a really good fictional story, you won't notice the page length. Anna Karenina was like that to me. But I think these strategies are really going to be helpful to me when I dive into these. I am also not going to rush. I think that's a key strategy just in reading in general. It's not a race. You don't have to finish things in a couple of weeks or a couple of months even. you can just read them at your own pace. And I think that's where I get hung up on things a lot, is that I don't want to take a long time reading a book. But definitely with these, I will have to. I would love to know what the longest work of classic nonfiction is that you have read. Have you read any of these? Have you read them in abridgments? Do you like abridgments? Is possibly a controversial question, but I'll ask it. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.